Hi, I'm Sushant and welcome to this online tutorial by Quest. JVP reflects two things. It reflects the jugular venous pressure as well as the jugular venous pulse, and both of these are reflections of the pressures in the right atrium. The waveforms of the JVP reflect the pressure changes and its pathophysiological changes. In this tutorial, let's try and understand these waveforms of the JVP. Now, the positive reflections in the JVP are called the waves, and we have three waves, the A, C and V waves. But the negative reflections in the JVP are known as the troughs, and we have two of them. We have the X descent and the Y descent. To understand the JVP, we have to understand that the right atrium has an input through the inferior and the superior vena cava, and it has an output that goes across the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. Imagine looking at this entire scenario from the point of view of right atrium. The maximum pressure would be generated when the right atrium contracts. The right atrial systole is at a time when the ventricle is in the diastole, and this leads to the first positive waveform known as the A wave. The A wave is the most prominent wave in the JVP. But as the atria starts relaxing, this is going to lower down the pressure, and that's going to lead to the first part of the descent known as the X descent. So relaxation of the atria would lead to the X descent. But we remember that as the atria relaxes, it's the time of the ventricle to contract. The first part of contraction of the right ventricle is that of isovolumic contraction. In this phase, the tricuspid valve is going to close, but the pulmonic valve is yet to open. As the ventricle undergoes this phase of contraction, the tricuspid valve is not only going to close, but it's going to bulge towards the right atrium. This bulge is going to cause a waveform in the right atrium, and that's going to be reflected in the JVP as the C wave. So the C wave happens when there is isovolumic contraction of the right ventricle. But after that, there is going to be opening of the pulmonic valve, and that would be the phase of ejection of blood from the right ventricle towards the pulmonary artery. Now imagine this phase. As the right ventricle is going to contract and send its blood outside towards pulmonary artery, the tricuspid valve, which was on the top of this blood column, is going to start moving downwards. As that moves downwards, there is going to be a fall in the pressure measured in the right atrium. This fall will be a continuation of the descent, and this is again the X descent. To differentiate it from the first one, we can call this X prime or X dash descent. But we have to understand that in a normal individual, we rarely see the C wave. So for most of us, after the A wave, there is just a continuous X descent. Now, while all of this was happening, remember the inflow of blood from the inferior and the superior vena cava was continuing. Now we have a tricuspid valve which has been closed, and there is going to be a diastole happening for the atria. The atria is going to accumulate all of this venous return, and gradually its pressure is going to mount, and this is going to cause a wave known as the V wave. The V wave is a slow rising wave because of the venous return coming to the right atria. This is going to happen as long as the atria is in diastole, or in other words, the ventricle is in the systole. But once the ventricle starts relaxing, there is going to be opening of the tricuspid valve. The moment the tricuspid valve opens, this entire blood in the right atrium is going to gush downwards. This is the rapid filling phase of the right ventricle, and that would be represented by a fall of pressure in right atrium known as the Y descent. So we have seen that we have the A wave, which is atrial contraction. We have the C wave, which is during the isovolumic contraction of the right ventricle leading to the bulge of the tricuspid valve. We have the V wave, which is because of the venous return. We also have the X descent, which can have components because of atrial relaxation as well as ejection of blood from below the tricuspid valve towards the pulmonary artery. And we have the Y descent, which is because of the rapid filling phase of the right ventricle diastole. Let us also understand what could go wrong with these waves. Well, if I have a situation such that the tricuspid valve is either closed, that is tricuspid stenosis, or the pressure in the right ventricle is too high, like a patient of pulmonary hypertension or right ventricular failure, now my atrial systole will have to really force down blood from the right atrium towards the right ventricle. This would lead to a prominent A wave. But imagine a situation where my right atrium just does not undergo a contraction. There is no atrial systole. Well, that situation would happen in a condition known as atrial fibrillation, where the atria, instead of contraction, is just dancing around. That would be a situation where I have no A wave, also known as absent A waves. But it's worthwhile to remember, when I have absent A wave, all I am seeing is V waves which are happening irregularly. A very interesting phenomenon happens in conditions known as tricuspid regurgitation. Now I want you to remember, tricuspid regurgitation is usually a fallout of increase in pulmonary artery pressure leading to right ventricular dilatation and eventually tricuspid regurgitation. Now, tricuspid regurgitation means that as my ventricle starts contracting, instead of sending the blood into the pulmonary artery, it starts leaking backwards into the right atrium. Now, when do you think this leaking is going to start? Obviously, as soon as my RV starts contracting. So as my right ventricle starts contracting, ideally I should have had an isovolumic contraction, which was the point of the C wave. But in this patient, instead of having a C wave, I would see a jet of blood going from the RV into the RA. This will start mounting up the pressure in the right atrium, and as long as my ventricle is in the systole, I am going to see a positive waveform rising in the right atrium. Remember, this is a huge jet coming from RV, that's a ventricular pressure, into RA. This will continue till the top of the V wave, because V wave was the time till which my ventricle was supposed to contract. Now I have a lot of blood coming inside the atrium through what is known as the CV wave. But remember, my atria was also going to receive a venous return coming from the inferior and the superior vena cava. So by the time my ventricular contraction is finished, I have a lot of blood in the right atrium. And as the diastole begins, during the rapid filling phase, all of this is going to gush down. And as it gushes down, I have a rapid and a prominent Y descent. Such a waveform where I have a CV wave followed by a prominent Y descent is classical of tricuspid regurgitation. Remember, tricuspid regurgitation is very often because of pulmonary hypertension, but this pulmonary hypertension is very often because of left-sided heart failure. To summarize, we have seen that the JVP or the jugular venous pulse has three prominent waveforms: the A wave, the C wave and the V wave, with two prominent descents, the X and the Y descents. We have also seen the causes of all of these, and we have seen various pathophysiologies which could change these beams. If there are any questions, feel free to discuss with me on the Quest app. Thank you and Jai Hind.